So Joe, I was just telling you, this is like one of the first couple of interviews that I've done in the new studio. So welcome to On the Pen. Thanks for giving us some time today.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, it's awesome to talk to you. So for those of you who don't know who Joe is the president of the Obesity Action Coalition. And the Obesity Action Coalition, he's going to tell you who they are a lot better than I will be able to. But for purposes of why I wanted to have Joe here today and why I'm so honored to have him here is, listen, we talk a lot about in this community about obesity being treated as a disease. We talk a lot about accessibility. We talk a lot about the future of these medications. And right at the center of that universe is this organization called the Obesity Action Coalition, who is out there doing the dirty work so that when we say obesity is a disease, we at least get some head nods from the crowd, right? Joe, tell me a little bit, because as we were kind of chatting before we came on, I think one of the things that people don't understand about the Obesity Action Coalition is that it is a patient-led or a patient-focused organization. Tell us a little bit about the history of OAC and why the OAC exists.
Yeah, Dave, thanks again for having me. And, it was 20 years ago. Actually, we're celebrating our 20th anniversary right now, but it was 20 years ago when a legislator stood up at a meeting of a group called Women in Government, which is a group that's primarily made up of female legislators across the country, although men are more than welcome to attend. And the legislator stood up at this meeting and said, I'm asked every day to do something about the obesity epidemic, but it's always by a public health official or by a doctor. I've never actually had someone with obesity walk into my office and ask me for that help. And so there were three people in that room that day, all of whom had a personal lived experience, also all three of whom who happened to be healthcare professionals. And they said, you know what? We're going to start that organization. And they recruited me to come and build that organization. And like most of our members, I personally live with obesity, currently well treated, using one of the new medicines that we hear about every day in the news these days. But like most people with obesity, I like to say that, I've tried it all, right? I've been in a dozen behavioral programs. This is now my seventh medicine that I've on to treat my
Wow.
obesity. So this has been a lifelong chronic illness for
You've
me. And
tried 7 medicines. You've tried just about all of them.
all of them, yeah, including some that don't exist anymore on the market, right, kind of thing. And again, one of the complications of this space, right, because of the group who, you talk about our history and all the things we advocated for. One of the biggest things we advocated for is actually the FDA to start approving these medicines, right, all those years ago. And of course, some of those medicines don't exist on the market anymore. And I mean, that's the challenge in this space, right? We don't have a perfect medicine when it comes to addressing obesity. But our work really has started 20 years ago to be the voice of people living with obesity, and we've done that ever since. Started off in an era 20 years ago where we were talking. It was the beginning of bariatric surgery in the prominence when we the laparoscopic era of bariatric surgery. And then we just had some behavior management to where we live today, where there's really exciting options in behavior, in medicine, in endoscopic procedures, and in bariatric procedures for people. And it really is our hope that someday everyone has access to these treatments, and then we stop being treated like second class citizens. Because the other thing I will say about my own journey and in my 20 years, and even being at the OAC, for never once has my insurance company paid for any of my obesity treatment for no amount of money. And OAC would pay any amount of money. Can we buy insurance for our employees that covers obesity care? And and the reality is that's where most of us live in this country, right? Most of us live at this point where we have to figure this out on our own, and in fact, we're second class citizens because of that, right? If we have money, we can afford it. We can afford it, and we can gain that coverage. But if you don't have the money, you don't have access, and that's a world we have to change.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you talk about the early days and getting the FDA on board with approving these medications, what did that process on the OAC side, what did that process kind of look like? And how did sort of going through that process as an organization sort of lay the groundwork for some of the stuff you're doing today?
Yeah, so if we go back now, 14, 15 years ago, the FDA wasn't approving any obesity medicines at all. And they actually did a series of hearings, pulling one medicine off sibutramine, which arguably, I mean, we could argue among healthcare professionals whether that medicine should still exist on the market, but it was sort of not defended. Nobody stood up and defended the medicine, and so therefore it came off the market. And then the agency started doing these hearings for the medicines that some of which still exist today. So, for example, Qsymia, phentermine topiramate, or locastrin, which is one that's been pulled off the market, which was marketed as Belviq, or Contrave, naltrexone bupropion. They started doing the hearings for those, and those first round of hearings, as we watched them and we participated from and during the public comment part, we realized something very quickly. No one on those panels who was evaluating those medicines from FDA actually had any experience with obesity, understood obesity from that perspective. And so then we went on a pretty significant advocacy effort to actually ask FDA to start populating those panels with true experts on obesity, to include the patient perspective in those hearings. And it took a couple of years, but a few years later, we started seeing the agency starting to approve those medicines moving forward. And by the way, that advocacy continues to today. So one of the things we've just done as OAC is FDA has actually proposed updating the guidance for what they call medicines for chronic weight management, or medicines for weight reduction, which we think should be medicines for obesity, by the way, but that's a topic for another day. But and we still comment on those guidance till today, because actually we think that guidance isn't actually good enough right now. If you want to enter into a clinical trial for obesity right now, the options that as you get into it, we either put a patient on placebo, meaning just some basic diet and exercise advice, or we put them on a new medicine. But we live in an era where there's really good medicines. Why would you put someone on a placebo, right? Let's put somebody on an existing medicine that we know
Right.
the risks profile for, we know the advantage profile, and then compare it to new medicines moving forward. That's what we do in every other disease state, but we're not doing that in obesity right now. We
Mm.
actually force people into it, into a therapy where there's probably only a 5 or 10% chance that they're going to have a great result. And the reality is, we would never do that if it was diabetes. You would never tell a person with diabetes that in order to be in a clinical trial for the new diabetes drug, you can't take any of the existing diabetes medicine. You can
Yeah.
only have diet and exercise, right? But we do that with obesity. And again, another example of
Mm.
how we're somewhat treated differently as people with obesity.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you're advocating for that, because I do think about that oftentimes. Getting into the clinical trial data is something that we do here at On the Pen. Sometimes we'll talk a lot about the future treatments that are on the horizon, because again, and you touched on this earlier, obesity is such a nuanced disease. There's no silver bullet. There's no magic pill for obesity, because it's incredibly nuanced. Not everybody experiences obesity the same way, and not everybody has the same type of obesity. That being said, the future medications are always intriguing, and I wonder how they get people to even stay on the placebo control group in those trials, because these drugs have become so powerful that people are losing 25% of their body weight over the course of a phase 3 trial, maybe 72 weeks. And you think about, that's a long chunk of somebody's life as an adult to live without treatment for their disease. So I love that you're advocating for that. I didn't even realize that. It's amazing.
Yeah,
Um,
no, it's interesting times when it comes to that, right? Because a lot of, I mean, it is not hard to enroll people in an obesity clinical trial right now. And one of the reasons it's not hard is because so many of us do not have access to care. But
mhm,
when we actually start improving access to care, it's going to be harder. And
mm,
the reality is that we're going to have to deal with those issues. And many of my days, Dave, are filled, talking to the future sponsors of these clinical trials to say, how do we keep people engaged in them? And I think one of the things that we've been advising folks to do is actually to offer full out high quality behavioral management. The reality is most of us have never experienced that, right? The kind of true behavioral management that really would support somebody moving forward. And again, I think if people offer high quality care as in their placebo group, that gives us an advantage, at least to keep people in for a year, right? That year
mhm.
timeline. As it extends past then, I think most of us are going to start getting frustrated and try to seek something else. And especially if our insurance changes and then suddenly we can access a new treatment option.
Yeah. You touched on something in your response there, just in terms of uh, talking about a day where access improves, right? And everything that we talk about. So on the pen is definitely it started as just a guy sharing his journey, and it's evolved. And my dream for on the pen is really that we become the source, and in many ways we have for the community, where patients can get obesity centric news from the patient perspective, so they can take that information and just go have better conversations with their providers. But no matter what we're talking about, Joe, whether we're talking about the topic of compounded medications, which has been a huge topic of conversation in the community, whether we're talking about accessibility from the insurance side, or whether we're talking about future medications that these companies are developing. All of it boils down to, can people get it? Because the whole conversation is not even worth having if people can't get it. And what I'd like for you to share a little bit about is some of the work, especially recently, in terms of the work that you've done spearheading kind of that drive for the Treat and Reduce Obesity Act, some of the changes in there in terms of the way the government views anti-obesity medications. Just talk a little bit about what gives you hope, maybe for what you're seeing for a future where people have more expanded access.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Dave. And access is the number one issue we face here at OAC. It is the number one thing, that number one call that we receive from folks about, there are people who truly need care. And I envision a world someday where if you woke up today and said, today's the day I want to do something to address my obesity, that you would be able to go to a healthcare provider. They would talk to you about all your treatment options, and none of those treatment options would be limited by your insurance, right? Kind of thing. But
Mm.
that's not the world we live in right now, right? The world I've always lived in is, I've got to go to a commercial plan because I can afford it. Or if I go to a dietitian, I get dietary counseling, even if maybe I should go and get medicine. But when I go to my doctor to talk about medicine, I just assume I don't have coverage, so they don't offer it to me. And or if you go to a surgeon, maybe a better chance that you have access to surgery. Probably 70% of people do, but it's still not everyone, and we still make people jump
Right.
through hoops and hurdles. So we've got to change that. And what we've done at OAC for now, gosh, the entire 20 years I've been here, is actually prioritize access to care. And I think one of the ways we've been trying to change the system is through this piece of legislation called the Treat and Reduce Obesity Act, which would actually change under Medicare two things. One is who can counsel for people with obesity. So right now under Medicare, you can only be counseled by your primary care provider, and I have a wonderful new primary care provider, so she actually could counsel me. But every other primary care provider I've had before this has no skills to do that, right, kind of thing. And
Mm.
so maybe that they're the wrong group, right? Not to offend all of them, but there are other more qualified people to do that counseling. And then the second part would be of people access to the new FDA approved medicines for obesity. But it's worth noting that it was in 2012 that we started that journey with the Treat and Reduce Obesity Act. So it's now
Mm.
13 plus years ago. And it
Wow.
was actually when Senator Carper, someone from Senator Carper's staff, now retired senator from Delaware, called me, an OAC's lobbyist or policy consultant. I guess we're not supposed to call them lobbyists anymore, but policy consultant. But he's a lobbyist, let's be honest. So someone from his staff called us and said, "Hey, we have this idea. We know people are having trouble getting counseling for their obesity, so we want to expand." And we envision like a world where you can get counsel at the YMCA or something along those lines, and actually get real evidence-based counseling. And we said, okay, we love that idea. Can we come in and talk to you? So we went in to talk to them, and the staffer, we explained to her, I said, we have a hope someday for a world where we have new medicines to help people. And by the way, this is before the pharma companies existed. Many of them were even working in this space, right? Kind of thing. There were no Novos and Lillies and all those other folks working in the space. And the staffer, her name was Lynn, she bought into it. She said, you know what, you're right, we should create that world. So let's expand who can counsel, and let's create the incentive for these companies to develop medicines by making them covered by Medicare. And so we started that all those years ago. Now that's been reintroduced as not to bore you with a system of politics in our country, but basically every 2 years a piece of legislation has to be reintroduced, right? Because our members of our House of Representatives flip over, it's considered a new Congress, right? So we've now reintroduced the Treat and Reduce Obesity Act in 8 Congresses, right? That's how
Wow.
long it's been, kind of thing, just because of the way the cycle works here. And it was just reintroduced just this week in the House of Representatives in the US. It's Bill 4231. Again, the Treat and Reduce Obesity Act. It looks exactly as it did, all those years ago. And it was introduced 2 weeks ago, Senate Bill 1973, in the Senate here in the US. And so now currently reintroduced, and advocacy will begin again to find co-sponsors, et cetera. And so if anyone is interested in advocating around that, I would encourage them to go to obesityaction.org, our website, and then visit our action center, because it'll actually just let me quickly send a note to your member of Congress to say, hey, support this legislation.
Mm.
Now, let's talk about all those years. So last Congress, the end of last Congress, we made the most progress ever on that fight. So first of all, the House Ways and Means Committee actually held a hearing on TROA and actually advanced out a limited version of that bill that basically would say, well, if you were receiving this treatment before you entered Medicare, we'll at least let you stay on it when you're on
Yeah.
Medicare.
I remember when
And
that happened, and that was
yeah,
going to be a question I had for you because it definitely seemed stripped down.
definitely for sure. And it was
Yeah.
all about money. Let's be honest with you. I mean, everything in this world is about money. So the Congressional Budget Office, which actually scores legislation, tells you how much it's going to cost over a 10-year window, determined that TROA would cost, or the drug part of TROA would cost, about $35 billion. And
Mhm.
so what the House Ways and Means Committee said is, we have $1 billion or $2 billion to spend. We don't have $35 billion. So let's find a version for that. And they put forward that version. But curiously, as that happened shortly afterwards, and that stopped suddenly. And why did it stop suddenly? That was because the Biden administration, in some last minute rulemaking, decided that they were going to cover these medicines for everybody,
Yeah.
and or started the rulemaking process to let these medicines be covered for everyone under Medicare and Medicaid. Unfortunately, earlier this year, the Trump administration chose not to advance that, but that wasn't particularly surprising, because most new administrations basically stopped the last minute rulemaking of previous administrations. And actually, we've had some positive conversations with the Trump administration and some of their departments about, they are still considering it. Well, whether it would look like the wide open coverage that the Biden administration was proposing is too early to tell. But
From
there is positives moving
your
forward.
perspective and your vantage point, spending time in Washington, D.C., kind of a two-part question without
Yeah.
stepping too much into politics.
Yeah.
Why do you think the Biden administration, obviously knowing that this was likely to be reversed, why did they wait until the
Yeah.
end of the administration? And then sort of on the Trump administration side, why do you think outside of maybe just that's kind of the protocol that they would drop those kind of last minute procedure and
Yeah.
rule changes? Do you think that the new administration has sort of an antithetical view of obesity medicine, or can you comment on those things?
Yeah, I think the last minute rulemaking part, I think, is mostly that the administration didn't expect to lose and was going to do it anyway, right? Kind of thing. And that was the reality of what you often see with some of
Mm,
that last minute rulemaking, right? Um, the Trump administration's change is not surprising, because that's what always happens. We do that, and they let it go further. They let it go for several months and actually did
right.
some investigation. So I actually think it is setting them up for that. I think the big issue around all of this is actually the Inflation Reduction Act drug price negotiation that's going on right now, that OAC is participating in. We are participating. I think the only patient group in obesity, and the only patients that are actually talking to the government about, hey, these drugs need to be more affordable. And so I think that negotiation is going on right now. I think that some of that playing out, that's playing out right now as we speak, and probably October, November timeline, will some of that information will start becoming public about what the new prices of these medicines will look like, or at least the maglets ought to look like moving forward.
And
And I think that'll
that
play a
is
big
all
role.
sort of,
Yeah.
for those who aren't tracking that conversation, the Inflation Reduction Act is sort of all within the confines of Medicare and Medicaid, right?
Right.
So
But what Medicare does, Dave, the private insurers follow. And if Medicare sets a price of, say, for example, these medicines are now, let's throw out a number, $300, you would expect private insurance also to quickly adopt that pricing structure as well, right? Kind of thing. And in a world, in my opinion, in a world where these medicines are priced in that range, we're having very different conversations with payers about covering these medicines, right? By the way, they already meet on, this is hard to wrap our heads around, right? But they already meet value, cost effectiveness conversations, right? Even $1,000 or $1,400 a month. And by the way, nobody pays that amount. There's these huge rebates that are given,
right.
things along those lines. But they already meet the value assessment, right? In terms of quality adjusted life years and things along those lines.
Mhm.
Doesn't mean they're not crazy expensive to the system if everyone started covering them, right? Kind of thing.
Right.
So there's a balance between those two items that we have to move forward. And so I always remind people that, yes, these medicines are too expensive right now to be an everyday medicine for every person who needs them, right? Kind of thing. Doesn't mean they're not valuable to the system somewhere down the future at the current prices, but we have to lower prices now to make it so that we can create the coverage that everybody needs.
Yeah, and that's really an indictment on the way that the system's set up, right? I mean, Medicare is one conversation, but when you look at private insurers, they're really only looking at a patient for what, 2 or 3 years before they go, you're someone else's problem. So the idea of all these private insurance companies picking up the tab on these medications to over, if you look at the clinical trials, like 72 months gets you down to a healthy BMI, then you go off and you're somebody else's healthy patient, right? I mean, that's kind of the design of the system.
Yeah, I think, but I don't know, Dave. I mean, part of me rejects that a little bit because I guess people rotate all the time, but like just like I could rotate in, somebody else could rotate into me who's already had that cost savings as well. So if everyone covered these, I think it would be a different situation. I
Yeah, well,
think,
the trick is
but
getting the first one to do it, right? Because nobody
right,
wants to be the first.
right. Right. And then again, when the first one does it, it's probably going to be under painful restrictions, right? And that's the other thing that really bothers me is like we have to jump through all kinds of hoops and hurdles. I know in, like, for example, in my wife's health insurance plan, like she can't, if she needed these, it was going to seek this treatment, she couldn't see it from a regular doctor. She has to go to some special doctor who's online, who pitches that, our goal is to get people off these medicines, not keep the people on them. And
Right.
that's not like, again, with our belief that obesity is a chronic disease, that's not the kind of approach I would want to start. I'm not saying that someone can't eventually come off, but you'd have to show me the data, right? Kind of thing about that. And I think that becomes the challenge with this in our system right now. And I think a big part of the problem are the pharmacy benefit managers when it comes to this. I mentioned that earlier, but if these companies are out there selling these medicines now for about $500 a month, or even some cases less to us in the public for the branded medicines, I guarantee you that an insurance company is paying less than that right now. And these rebates are pretty substantial that are going back to these companies. And that needs to be transparent. I think that's one thing that really bothers me. Like, I really wish I could tell how much these medicines really cost, but the reality is the system is completely opaque and you can't actually tell
Yeah.
how much they cost.
Yeah, I mean, the closest thing you really get to that is in earnings calls when Novo or Lilly talks about the gross to net pricing, which is just, again, is a big convoluted thing that I think is ultimately my belief. I'll put on my tinfoil hat, is that this thing's designed so the average person can't make hide or hair of it because there's so many hands in the pot and so many people getting rich off of sick Americans, and that conversation obviously transcends obesity and gets into sort of every other chronic disease area as well. It's just a sad state
Yeah,
of
yeah,
affairs.
Dave, it's interesting since you mentioned investor calls because I do listen to them too, because that's where we can actually get some of the best data, as you just said. And it is actually interesting to listen to the push and pull because obviously there's people like us who are saying lower these prices, make these drugs much less expensive, and by the way, then you'll just sell it to hundreds of millions of people and you still make plenty of money, right? But
Right.
then if you listen to the investors and some of the questions, I mean, there are people pushing them to make these drugs more expensive,
Yep.
right? And so you have
Yep.
to realize that there is a push and pull here. I mean,
Yep.
when Lilly released their medicine at a discount to Novo's medicine when they first released Zepbound, right, kind of thing, they took a lot of criticism, right? We had a
Yeah.
drug that on paper arguably was more effective,
Yeah.
and yet they priced it lower, and they took grief for that, right, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So just remember, for all of us that are saying lower these medicines, there actually is a population out there and probably all of us are benefiting in our retirement plans, right, kind of thing, in our mutual funds, and 401ks and 403bs, right, kind of thing, from owning stock in these companies, right, kind of thing, because there are people out there saying, hey, price these drugs even more expensive. So
Yeah, yeah, it's one of the things that I've taken flack for too, is just pointing that stuff out. When Lilly brought Zepbound to market, they brought it to market significantly less, at a significantly less list price than you saw Wegovy at. And then, even there, I go, they both now have cash pay. Lilly and Novo have cash pay options, and Wegovy, they're still priced right at the same price as Zepbound. And so, yeah, there is a push and pull, and we are well acclimated to that on the pen because we follow these earnings calls closely, um, and definitely I would consider myself an advocate of PBM reform on that topic. I'm curious what the Obesity Action Coalition's sort of stance or position is on this idea of most favored nation. Now, it started off as an executive order, but now we've seen a bipartisan push. Representative Ro Khanna out in California has actually introduced a bill in the
yeah.
House. Where does the OAC sit on that? I mean, obviously it's a bigger conversation than just obesity medicine, like the Treat and Reduce Obesity Act is. But have you given that some thought?
So we've actually started analyzing it. We've actually looked at, curiously created charts of what models of pricing look like in other parts of the world to start evaluating those and actually do a deep dive. Like, because I do worry. I mean, look, every day we get reached out to by a new company developing obesity medicines here, or future obesity medicines here in the US. And I want to see that development continue, right? Just because
Right.
we have two good medicines right now doesn't mean that's enough, right? We need actually a lot
100%.
more, just knowing from my experience. So we want this R&D to continue, but the balance there is moving forward. But we'll work within whatever process exists, right? Kind of thing. So if most favored nation becomes the process, we'll move forward. If PBM reform, you know, part of me says, well, at least let's at least reform PBM to look at it first and make it more transparent so we can make these decisions. Because what I worry about most favored nation would be is, are we going to do that pricing and then still expect PBMs to make some of the monies that they're making right now? And then where do we end up with this, right? So those
Yeah.
details haven't to come yet. So I think we're paying attention to it. Obviously, it's sort of and it will remind me of, again, not to delve too much into politics, because just today the big beautiful bill passed the
Yep.
Senate, right, kind of thing. And so, like, do we focus on overall funding for Medicaid, or do we focus for coverage of obesity care within Medicaid? And so OEC's position is, well, we're focused on obesity care within Medicaid, not overall Medicaid. And so
Mhm.
that's kind of the same adjustment. Like, how much time do I spend on PBM reform or most favored nation,
Right.
or versus how much time I spend on, in a small organization, on the actual issue, like, for example, working within the IRA process to actually get a better price, because that's the system we have right now.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I think one of the things that people would be interested in about most favored nation, there's obviously a lot of misunderstanding about what it is. Everybody just thinks, oh, we'll just pay as much as Canada. Well, the idea is actually that the rest of the world comes up and we
Yeah,
come down, not we just go to where they're at today.
right.
And I think interestingly, the way that these if you look closely, I mean, there's not a lot of really great, easily accessible data on what other countries charge for these medicines. But when you look at it, for example, a big story that came out a couple months ago is Lilly brought Manjaro to the Indian market, and it was I think $50 a vial for the 2.5 milligram or 5 milligram. I can't remember which one it was, but people just heard $50
Does.
Manjaro, and
Yeah.
actually it's $50 a vial, and it's a single use vial. So it's actually $200 a month.
Yep.
But then they tier up their pricing as you go up in dose. So once you get to the 15 milligram dose, they're paying everybody as much as we are for our list price here. So they've been careful, perhaps knowing that the Trump administration would want to revive this, or maybe just in general, knowing that they were going to face scrutiny over the cost of the United States versus other countries. Anyways, all that regardless, said, it'll be very interesting to see how that stuff shakes out. I do think that it could be beneficial, but to your point, it's hard to have that without also addressing this PBM thing. And I understand the tension that the OAC has on where do we focus our finite resources to really be impactful. Joe, first of all, I think you and I could probably talk for a very long time about a lot of this stuff. And so I hope that we get the chance to do it again. But why don't you, for the purposes of those who are watching and have stayed, this whole half hour, why don't you give me your elevator pitch on, you talked about finite resources, but you've also talked about all the work that you're doing to not only get obesity recognized as a disease by the people who need to recognize it as a disease so change can happen, but also for legislation that increases accessibility, that helps people who are on the fringes of accessing treatment to get them right. You're doing all this work. We would like to help you grow. Why should people get involved? Why should patients get involved? And how can they get involved?
Yeah, so I think getting involved in OAC is super easy. You can just visit obesityaction.org, and membership in OAC is free, right? There's a paid level if you choose. You want to contribute to the cause, you can do that way, but you can also just join the organization. Check out our resources. Our resources exist to help people along their journey. That's our educational and our support resources. And then when you're ready for advocacy, or if you're ready to start an advocacy right now, there are all kinds of things you can do through our action center. We have advocacy teams in certain parts of the country. All of these resources are designed, again, by people living with obesity, for people living with obesity, to get involved in this policy process. And there are lots of things you can do. This is not going up to not in every case is going up to Washington, D.C. and protesting or locking yourself to the front of the FDA, although we've never done that, though we've talked about it before. Um, it is going into those buildings and talking to legislators, but it also can simply be making a phone call or sending emails. And there's lots of activities at the state level as well. For all the things we talked about federally today, there's probably 50 times as many going on at the state levels with lots of activity, and we cover many of those as well. So I would just encourage people to check us out, to learn more about us, and then really to read our resources and not make assumptions about our background. And if you have a question about it, just reach out to us, and we'll tell you what our position on it. And we may not agree on every issue, but the reality is that a lot of these issues are complicated, and we'll always tell you why we think about a certain way on a certain topic.
Awesome. Am I still with you, Joe?
I
Audio?
don't see your image anymore. I hear you audio though.
Did you hear
So
my audio?
yes,
All
yeah,
right. I'm
yeah,
not sure what happened, but I fell off.
yeah.
One of the things that I would ask of you, speaking to this community specifically, you know, as well as I know, that shortages of these medications has
Yep.
led to this really, really crazy, difficult to navigate environment of compounded medications. I would like you to maybe just speak to the person who is on compound, who has maybe just heard, oh, the OAC was anti-compound. I
Yep.
don't believe in what they're doing. Maybe could you just speak to that person right now and just and tell them why what you're doing is important to them too.
Yeah, no, I will just say right now, it is OEC's position that we do not support compounding, right? We don't believe that it meets our quality requirements, our evidence requirements for safety and or effectiveness. I do not blame a single person who is utilizing a compounded product. Um, I understand that. I've experienced shortages in my own care, and I understand that temptation to use that moving forward. This is a systems problem, not an individual problem. But I would urge everyone who is using a compounded product to make sure they're getting the highest quality medical care possible, supporting them in that journey, because it really is our true concern is really about the safety and effectiveness. And it's important that, if you're using a compounded product, you're at least talking to your doctor every month about what side effects you're experiencing or not experiencing, and if you should be worried about that. So with that being said, we really do understand the personal choice of choosing to use a compounded product. Our biggest argument has been that, despite all of our efforts to determine what's a good compounder and what's a bad compounder, I just can't tell the difference right now. And until we do that, we're not 100% comfortable with compounding.
Well, I appreciate you being willing to jump in on that topic. Sorry about the technical difficulties. I appreciate you being willing to jump in on that topic, because I think there are a contingent of people who have relied on compounds for safe and affordable access, especially, when from my position, I always was kind of like the 503Bs have been regulated by the FDA under the
Yep.
FDNC. When those went away, everything else kind of got squirrely. My big concern right now, Joe, is that you would not believe the amount of people who have moved to these research grade
Oh
versions
yeah.
that are just,
See.
and that's sort of where we're at, right?
Yep.
I'm talking hundreds of thousands of people have moved that direction. So it's never been more critical, the fight that you're in, and that OnThePen stands with you, and to get affordable access to the branded medications. I appreciate the work that you've done at the OAC. Appreciate the work that you continue to do and will do in the future. There's an event coming up here in a few weeks. You want to tell everybody about that quick and how they could get involved?
Yeah, yeah. So the Your Weight Matters annual convention is our patient gathering of experts. So you hear about all these scientific meetings and things across the country, whether that's the Obesity Society meetings, the American Diabetes Association meetings about obesity. This is the patient version. You can find out more at ywmconvention.com. But it is a gathering of patient advocates supporting each other, learning from the best scientists about this issue. And then at this one, because it is located in Washington, D.C., we will spend the first day on Capitol Hill actually sharing our experiences with legislators. So that's coming up here July 24th through the 26th. But if any of your folks who are watching this today or listening to this today want to check it out, just go to ywmconvention.com.
All right. I appreciate you sharing that, Joe. As you may know, when we got the chance to meet a couple months ago, I was up in DC. I had the chance to sit in on a conversation that you invited me to. I appreciated the opportunity to do that, and definitely took the opportunity on my own to go around and meet with Senator Cassidy's office and Mr. Fetterman's office. And we just kind of did the rounds and had the chance to do some of that on our own. I love that you're putting that opportunity together for others as well. Joe, thanks so much for spending some time with us today. I hope that we get the chance to do it again. And everybody go check out the Obesity Action Coalition's website. Check out the work that they're doing. It is extremely, extremely important work and extremely beneficial to you. If you live with the disease of obesity, you are benefiting from the hard work of people like Joe and his team at the OAC. Joe, thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, take care.